Ladies and gentlemen, today we stand at the crossroads of history. A decision has been made that will shape economies, redefine alliances, and test our resilience. India has ended trade with America. For decades, the trade relationship between India and America has been one of the defining pillars of their bilateral engagement, encompassing not just the exchange of goods, but also services, technology, and capital flows. This economic partnership was often held up as a model of mutual benefit. India supplied the United States with everything from high-quality textiles and affordable pharmaceuticals to cutting-edge IT services, while America exported advanced machinery, aircraft, agricultural products, and sophisticated technology to India. In recent years, bilateral trade figures regularly cross the $100 billion mark, making the United States one of India's top trading partners, and India one of the fastest-growing markets for American companies. The arrangement was not merely transactional. It carried strategic undertones, reinforcing diplomatic ties and creating interdependence that bolstered cooperation in areas like defense, counterterrorism, and climate policy. However, beneath this image of smooth cooperation, tensions had been quietly building for years. Disputes over tariffs frequently surfaced, with each side accusing the other of unfair trade practices. The United States had criticized India's protective tariffs on certain goods, arguing they restricted American exports, while India had objected to U.S. agricultural subsidies and restrictions that made it harder for Indian products to compete fairly. Intellectual property rights became another sticking point, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector, where India's policy of producing affordable generic medicines often clashed with American patent laws. These economic disagreements were compounds. Dead by deeper geopolitical differences on some international issues, the two nations found themselves on opposite ends of the debate. The situation worsened as both governments began adopting more assertive economic policies. India's push for Atmanirbhar Bharat, a vision for self-reliance championed by its leadership, emphasized reducing dependence on foreign imports and boosting local manufacturing. While the policy was not directly anti-American, its emphasis on limiting certain foreign goods and services inevitably impacted U.S. businesses. Simultaneously, America pursued its own America First trade agenda, re-examining all foreign trade deals to ensure they were serving its domestic industries. This mutual turn inward created an environment in which trade frictions were no longer isolated disputes, but part of a broader divergence in economic philosophy. Compounding these economic strains were moments of political unease. Diplomatic conversations over defense alignments, climate commitments, and digital sovereignty, including data privacy regulations that limited the free flow of information, added layers of complexity to the relationship. Trust began to erode, and what once could be resolved through negotiation started to look like irreconcilable differences. A few high-profile trade disputes escalated to the point of retaliatory tariffs, each side imposing duties that sent strong political messages but further reduced goodwill. In this context, the eventual decision for India to end trade with America was not the result of a single dispute or one sudden disagreement, but the culmination of years of mounting economic, political, and strategic differences. It was both a practical step in line with the decision for India to end trade with America was rooted in a complex mix of economic, political, and strategic factors that had been intensifying over the past several years. On the surface, it might appear as a sudden rupture, but the underlying reasons reveal a gradual erosion of trust, an accumulation of grievances, and a shifting global economic landscape that made this move both possible and, in the eyes of some Indian policymakers, necessary. One of the primary drivers was the escalating conflict over tariffs and market access. For years, Washington had voiced concerns about what it saw as India's restrictive trade policies, pointing to high tariffs on certain imports, such as agricultural products, electronics, and automobiles. The United States argued that these barriers limited its ability to sell goods into the Indian market on competitive terms. India, however, defended its policies as measures to protect nascent industries, ensure food security, and shield small-scale farmers from being overwhelmed by heavily subsidized American agribusiness. On the other side, Indian officials accused the U.S. of imposing unfair duties on steel, aluminum, and certain manufactured goods, as well as maintaining agricultural subsidies that distorted global markets and hurt Indian farmers. This tit-for-tat approach fostered a climate of frustration where both nations saw themselves as being treated unfairly. Intellectual property rights disputes added another layer of tension. India's pharmaceutical industry, known globally for producing affordable generic medicines, often found itself in conflict with American pharmaceutical giants who sought to enforce strict patent protections. While India's approach allowed millions of people in developing countries to access life-saving drugs at lower costs, it clashed with US laws designed to protect corporate research investment. Efforts to bridge these differences repeatedly stalled, leaving resentment on both sides. Geopolitics also played a crucial role. While India and America had cooperated in various strategic arenas, including defense and counterterrorism, they did not always align on global issues. Differences in stance towards certain conflicts, climate change obligations, and trade alliances meant that their long-term interests were not always in sync. The United States' pressure on India to take positions in line with its own foreign policy sometimes clashed with New Delhi's desire to maintain a non-aligned, independent approach. Domestic politics amplified these external pressures. In India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative became a rallying cry for economic self-reliance, pushing for reduced dependency on foreign imports and the nurturing of homegrown industries. This vision inherently required re-evaluating trade relationships, particularly with countries perceived as exerting disproportionate influence over Indian markets. In America, the political climate favored reshoring manufacturing and prioritizing domestic production, further eroding the mutual benefits of the partnership. Digital sovereignty disputes were another flashpoint. India's regulations on data localization and restrictions on certain foreign digital platforms were seen in Washington as barriers to American tech companies. India, for its part, framed these measures as necessary for national security and economic independence in the digital age. Taken together, these economic disputes, ideological differences, and strategic recalibrations created a situation where continuing trade no longer aligned with India's long-term goals. Ending trade with America became not just an act of economic policy, but a declaration of independence in shaping its own path in the global order. The immediate economic impact of India ending trade with America is both far-reaching and multifaceted, touching nearly every sector of the economy in both countries and sending ripples through global markets. For decades, the United States had been one of India's largest export destinations, a reliable market for products ranging from textiles and pharmaceuticals to IT services and automotive parts. The abrupt halt in trade has meant that these industries, many of which are deeply integrated into US-bound supply chains, have had to grapple with sudden order cancellations, revenue losses, and logistical disruptions. Textile manufacturers in India's key hubs, such as Tirupur and Surat, for example, have reported warehouses full of unsold goods that were meant for American retailers. Pharmaceutical companies, particularly those specializing in generic drugs, have lost a critical market, potentially affecting not only their profits, but also the global supply of affordable medicines. The IT and services sector, one of India's strongest economic engines, faces a particularly complex challenge. For years, Indian software firms, consulting agencies, and outsourcing companies had depended heavily on American clients. Contracts have now been suspended or terminated, forcing these firms to seek alternative markets in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific, often at lower margins. The sudden drop in demand has led to hiring freezes and, in some cases, layoffs, particularly in mid-sized firms that lack the resources to pivot quickly. On the American side, the loss of access to Indian markets has been equally disruptive. US companies in sectors such as aerospace, agricultural exports, and high-end manufacturing have found themselves cut off from one of the fastest-growing consumer bases in the world. Agricultural producers, especially soybean and cotton farmers, are feeling the sting of lost contracts, as India had been a significant importer of these commodities. The disruption has not only impacted revenues, but also created a surplus of unsold goods, pushing down domestic prices and squeezing farmers' incomes. Global supply chains are another major casualty of this rupture. Many products, especially in technology manufacturing, rely on components or raw materials that pass through both Indian and American systems at different stages of production. For instance, certain electronics parts assembled in India are exported to the US, where they are integrated into finished products, while specialized components from America were essential for Indian manufacturers. The sudden freeze in trade has forced companies to scramble for alternative suppliers, often at higher costs and with significant delays. Financial markets have also reacted sharply. The announcement triggered a dip in the stock prices of major Indian exporters and American companies with heavy India exposure. Currency volatility increased, with the Indian rupee experiencing short-term downward pressure as investors assessed the potential damage to export revenues. Perhaps most significantly, the immediate impact has extended beyond just numbers. The psychological effect on investors, entrepreneurs, and workers has been profound. Confidence in stable bilateral trade has been shaken, and businesses that once planned for long-term expansion in each other's markets are now pulling back, reassessing strategies, and bracing for an uncertain future. This uncertainty is, in many ways, as disruptive as the trade loss itself, as it makes economic recovery harder to predict or plan for. The political and diplomatic repercussions of India ending trade with America have been immediate, visible, and deeply consequential for the broader international order. This move has not only disrupted economic ties, but also sent a powerful political signal, reshaping how both nations perceive each other and forcing a recalibration of their respective foreign policy strategies. In the immediate aftermath, diplomatic channels between New Delhi and Washington became strained, with both sides engaging in pointed public statements. American officials expressed deep disappointment and warned of potential retaliatory measures, including sanctions, tighter visa regulations, and the suspension of certain bilateral programs. Indian leaders, on the other hand, framed the decision as a sovereign right to protect national interests, arguing that it was necessary to reduce dependency on a single partner whose trade policies they saw as increasingly unpredictable. Behind the scenes, high-level diplomatic engagements have been reduced, with planned summits postponed or cancelled, symbolizing a cooling of political warmth that had taken years to build. The fallout has extended into multilateral forums. At gatherings like the G20, WTO, and UN General Assembly, the once cooperative tone between Indian and American delegations has shifted toward guarded interactions. Issues where the two countries previously aligned, such as counterterrorism, maritime security, and climate change initiatives, may now see reduced collaboration. This cooling of ties risks creating space for other powers to influence India's position on global matters, where the US had previously counted on its support. Regionally, the decision has been interpreted as a bold assertion of India's independent foreign policy. While some allies in Asia and Africa view the move as a demonstration of economic sovereignty, others are concerned about the potential instability it may introduce into global trade patterns. For countries already navigating tensions between the US and China, India's disengagement from American trade could alter the strategic balance, potentially pushing India closer to alternative economic blocs such as BRICS or strengthening its role in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. For the United States, the diplomatic setback is significant. Losing trade ties with the world's most populous country undermines its Indo-Pacific strategy, which had been designed in part around strong US-India cooperation to counterbalance China's growing influence. With India now signaling a more non-aligned stance, Washington faces the challenge of recalibrating its approach to the region, possibly relying more heavily on Japan, Australia, and ASEAN nations to maintain its strategic objectives. The domestic political impact in both countries is also notable. In India, the government's decision has been framed as a bold step toward economic independence, appealing to nationalist sentiment and strengthening political support at home. In the US, however, the move is likely to become a talking point in partisan debates, with critics accusing the administration of mismanaging a vital relationship and jeopardizing American jobs tied to exports. In the long term, these diplomatic repercussions could lead to a more fragmented global order, where India and America pursue parallel but less cooperative paths. While back-channel diplomacy may eventually restore some form of engagement, the trust deficit created by this rupture will take years, if not decades, to overcome. While the decision to end trade with America has caused immediate disruptions and diplomatic friction, it also presents India with a unique set of opportunities that could reshape its economic and strategic trajectory. Throughout history, moments of crisis have often acted as catalysts for transformation, forcing nations to rethink dependencies, innovate under pressure, and explore untapped possibilities. For India, this rupture is no different. It may serve as the spark that drives a new era of self-reliance, diversification, and global repositioning. One of the most immediate opportunities lies in accelerating domestic manufacturing under the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative. Without the ease of importing certain goods from the United States, India will need to expand its capacity to produce everything from advanced machinery and electronics to pharmaceuticals and agricultural technology. This necessity could stimulate investment in local industries, create jobs, and encourage the transfer of skills and technology within the country. Government incentives, if paired with private sector innovation, could significantly strengthen India's industrial base and reduce the trade deficit over time. The break with America also encourages India to diversify its trade partnerships. Over-reliance on a single major market can make any economy vulnerable to political or economic disputes. By redirecting its focus toward emerging markets in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and even parts of Eastern Europe, India can develop a more resilient export strategy. Strengthening economic ties with BRICS nations, Gulf countries, and ASEAN members could open new trade corridors, balancing the risk that comes with dependence on a single dominant partner. Additionally, this shift presents India with the chance to position itself as a hub for South-South cooperation, facilitating trade, technology exchange, and investment flows between developing nations. Such an approach would not only reduce dependency on traditional Western markets, but also enhance India's influence in shaping alternative economic frameworks that prioritize equitable growth over protectionist policies. Innovation and technological independence represent another critical opportunity. Many sectors in India, particularly in information technology, renewable energy, and biotechnology, have relied heavily on American software, patents, and research partnerships. The disruption of these ties may push Indian companies and research institutions to develop indigenous technologies or seek collaborative ventures with nations that are more aligned with India's long-term vision. This could foster a stronger ecosystem for homegrown startups and expand the role of Indian talent in global innovation chains. From a geopolitical standpoint, ending trade with America gives India greater flexibility in its foreign policy. Free from the constant economic leverage of a single dominant partner, New Delhi can negotiate with multiple powers from a position of relative independence. This could lead to more balanced defense agreements, diversified energy partnerships, and a broader range of international collaborations that are not constrained by US priorities. In the long run, while the immediate effects of this trade break are challenging, the opportunity to redesign India's economic architecture is immense. By embracing diversification, innovation, and strategic autonomy, India can transform this moment of disruption into a foundation for a more self-reliant and globally influential future. The road ahead for India, in the wake of ending trade with America, will be marked by both formidable challenges and transformative possibilities. This decision represents a turning point that will require careful navigation, not only to manage the immediate economic fallout, but also to build a sustainable framework for the nation's long-term growth and strategic autonomy. The coming years will demand a blend of pragmatism, innovation, and diplomatic finesse if India is to turn this rupture into a stepping stone toward a more self-reliant and globally competitive future. One of the most pressing tasks will be the stabilization of the domestic economy. The loss of a major export market like the United States inevitably creates short-term revenue gaps for key industries such as textiles, pharmaceuticals, IT services, and auto parts. Policymakers will need to introduce targeted relief measures, including tax incentives, low-interest credit lines, and subsidies for sectors most affected. In parallel, there must be a push to scale up domestic consumption so that the internal market can absorb at least part of the production previously intended for export. This could also be an opportunity to address income inequality and expand the purchasing power of India's middle and lower income groups, thereby creating a more robust and resilient domestic demand base. Expanding and diversifying international trade relationships will be another crucial step. India will need to actively pursue new bilateral and multilateral agreements with nations across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Strategic partnerships with ASEAN countries, African Union members, and Gulf states could provide alternative export destinations and secure supply chains for critical imports. Participation in emerging economic blocs, as well as regional trade agreements, will help reduce vulnerability to the economic and political pressures of any single trading partner. The technological and industrial transition will also play a decisive role. The disruption in US imports of advanced machinery, software, and high-tech components must be countered with a comprehensive strategy to boost indigenous innovation, increased investment in research and development, public-private collaboration in high-tech manufacturing, and stronger intellectual property frameworks can ensure that India not only fills existing gaps, but also becomes a producer of globally competitive technology. This shift could extend to sectors such as renewable energy, defense production, and advanced pharmaceuticals, making India less dependent on external suppliers for critical technologies. On the diplomatic front, India must tread carefully to ensure that this break in trade does not escalate into broader political isolation. Maintaining dialogue with the US, even in the absence of direct trade, will be important to preserve cooperation in other areas such as defense, education, and climate change. At the same time, India can leverage its independent stance to build credibility as a mediator and a bridge between competing global powers, enhancing its role in shaping a multipolar world order. Ultimately, the road ahead will test India's capacity for resilience and adaptability. If navigated wisely, this period of transition could redefine the country's place in the global economy, turning a moment of rupture into a catalyst for self-reliance, innovation, and strengthened geopolitical influence. Ask ChatGPT.